So picking up where we left off, I've basically just gotten rid of that extra layer and brought everything back to full visibility and updated scene 2 so that we would be back to a place where we saw all our geometry and we wouldn't have that problem switching between scene 1 and scene 2. Now basically this video I want to focus on focus and exposure. So I'm going to go ahead and twirl this down so that we can begin to look at our focus and exposure. Now we have these two icons on our toolbar that are directly tied to our focus and our exposure settings, and the way that these work is that this focal distance button, which is this ruler looking thing right here with the FD, is basically going to allow us to pick a focal distance. If I click on that center cube right there, the face of that, you can see I'm getting a readout here of 6.657 meters. If I click on the surface of this, I'm getting one for 2.049 and so on and so forth. I can keep clicking and getting different focal distances, but the idea is that wherever I click, that's going to be the place where the camera is going to be 100% perfectly in focus. Now, this other button here is our depth of field button. And the idea here with this icon is that we're going to be able to do 2 clicks. And the idea with the 2 clicks is if I click here, I'm setting the near plane. And if I click here, I'm setting the far plane. And the idea is I get 2 readouts. I get one for 1.864 meters, which is our near plane, and one for 3.763 meters, which is our far plane. Now the idea is that anything that's closer than our near plane is going to be progressively out of focus, and anything that's farther than our far plane is going to be progressively out of focus based on the f-stop. Now what this does is it automatically sets the f-stop so that whatever's within those 2 points will be in focus. What's interesting is that as soon as we've made those 2 clicks, if I click again, what effectively happens is I've switched back over to our focal distance tool. I can't keep clicking the 2 clicks like I can with the focal distance. I have to re-click this again to set those 2 points. So I'm going to set a point here and a point there. And again, I get my 2 settings, my near and far. However, you can see now my f-stop is down to 1. Now, what does this whole f-stop thing mean? Well, if you're new to cameras or you've never really used a camera before, the idea with the f-stop is effectively controlling our depth of field. And depth of field is basically the idea that things that are nearer than our near plane and farther than our far plane are out of focus, more or less depending upon what our f-stop is. A low f-stop will give us things that are more out of focus, and a high f-stop will give us things that are more and more in focus. The idea being is that if you set the f-stop high enough, then everything's in focus from here to infinity. So let's just go ahead and see how this is borne out in the Fire engine by coming over here, hitting Fire, and then hitting Enable. And you can see here that basically we have a really low f-stop, and our focal distance here will be set on this middle cube. So effectively, this is going to be blurry, and that's going to be blurry, but the center cube is going to be in focus. If I come over here and set the focus on this front cube like so, you can see that this is now sharp, and then these two are blurry. And if I come over here and I set the focal distance here on this back cube, you can see this is more blurry, this is less blurry, and then that's in focus. So the idea here is that we can simply click wherever we want, and Fire will automatically update so that we're getting this f-stop value, but we're getting it at whatever place we're wanting the focus to be. So these two work in conjunction with each other to set the focal point, but also to set the depth of field. And that's effectively what this blurry thing is. Now, one thing you should know about depth of field is that the more that we're seeing a blur, what we're seeing here, this is a depth of field effect. That takes longer to render. It's more processing on the part of Maxwell to make that depth of field effect. So if you want rendering to happen quicker, increase your f-stop so that we have more of an infinity type focus. And what will happen then is that the rendering will happen quicker. So that's just one of those little tricks that can make your renderings happen quicker. And oftentimes people will have an exaggerated depth of field thinking that, it might look kind of cool, but they don't really care. However, it's really impacting their render time. So be aware of that when you're thinking about how do I speed up my renders. Having a strong depth of field effect can really slow down your renders tremendously. So having this f-stop be higher is really going to solve that problem. And I tend to work with my f-stop somewhere around the 32 range most of the time to get something that's near an infinity level focus. Now, aside from our depth of field and our focal distance, we also have to worry about our exposure. Now, there's really a couple ways that we can handle this. The simplest is simply to have this icon locked like it is now and use our Eevee Slider. Now, the idea with the Eevee Slider is that effectively it's going to allow us to set our exposure value, which is sort of a combination of our f-stop, our shutter, and our ISO. Now, if we don't want to use Eevee, we can unlock this and we can come in here and we can manually set our f-stop, our shutter, and our ISO to get precisely the exposure that we want. However, bear in mind that this is also going to affect our depth of field. I prefer to think of the locked icon basically being exposure for the slider, the Eevee, and our depth of field for f-stop, and not really worry about what happens in terms of these other two. So that tends to be the way that I want to work with our Maxwell setup in general. I like the Eevee. It's a really easy thing to understand. However, there's one little thing that I changed here that you're going to want to change as well, and that is on our context button. If I click that, you'll see that I have my decimals for 3. If you have your decimals set for 0, what's going to happen is that when you move this slider, things are going to happen in too big of a jump. And the Eevee is a very sensitive parameter. So my feeling is that you're going to want to go ahead and set the decimals pretty low so that you can have a much more sensitive slider here. Now, what I want to do here is I just want to go ahead and set the Eevee a little bit higher, say around 16, so that we can see it underexposed. Underexposed means the light has less effect. And then if we come and we set that for a lower value, somewhere around, say, 13 or so, you'll see that it's overexposed, meaning the light has a lot more of an effect. So the idea here is that you just want to kind of adjust this until you're getting the perfect balance where the light is having the desired amount of effect and things don't look too dark or they don't get too blown out. And that's basically the whole idea of working with this Eevee. Now, you can get really mathematically precise about these things, but I tend to kind of eyeball it. But bear in mind that each lighting scenario is going to yield a different result, meaning that if I were to change this to something like, say, early morning, I'm going to have to change my Eevee because the earlier it is, the less light there's going to be in the scene, which means that to get an accurate amount of exposure, I would need to increase the exposure by decreasing my Eevee. So here, maybe that's a bit much. Maybe somewhere around 11 is going to be good. You can see that I'm getting good exposure even though we're at an early morning time. And so that's something to bear in mind when you're thinking about exposure value, is that this is not a constant thing. It's going to change on a per scene basis depending upon how your lighting is set up. So I'm just going to go ahead and set that back to something around noon, and you'll see now it's all blown out because, again, it's changed due to the lighting. So just bear that in mind that this is not a fixed value. It's something that you're going to want to change constantly. Now, aside from those two things, there's some additional things that you need to be aware of when you're thinking about working with cameras. And we're going to look at those things in the next video.